now. Okay, so the recording is beginning, and that allows me to greet all of you and to welcome you to a wonderful book launch that we are having for Aesthetic Programming, a handbook of software studies by Winnie Soon and Jeff Cox. I am Mark Marino. Welcome to those of you, especially those of you watching the recording later on, but those of you gathered here today to our ELIT monthly reading group session that is hosted by the HACS Lab, the Humanities and Critical Code Studies Lab here at USC. Of course, we've been online and virtual this whole year, but that's allowed us to have a series of book launches and guests like we never could have had during the regular semester. Of course, we would love to see these folks in person, in the flesh. I have been a big fan of our two authors today for quite some time. I got to meet Winnie and see some of their work, I believe at an electronic literature organization conference first, and then have followed ever since. And for a while, they've been collaborating with Jeff Cox on some projects that I have also been very interested in. Jeff Cox, of course, author of various things, among other things, Speaking Code, a book with Alex McLean, a really uncommon book in the software studies series, although one that I think is very much lays the groundwork for what we see in the second book, because Speaking Code in many, makes the argument that code itself can speak, something that folks who are associated with the Critical Code Studies Lab, I think, are enthusiastically behind. But it is a rare and uncommon book, again, that seems in nice conversation with aesthetic programming, that allows a duet between Jeff's critical writing and Alex McLean's code throughout the book. So another really wonderful book. But let me begin with some formal introductions, reading from their author bios. Jeff Cox likes not to think of himself as an old white man from a parochial island, but is clearly in denial. I think one of the things I love most about Jeff and Winnie are their senses of humor that we see throughout this book, Aesthetic Programming, and throughout their writing, and I think you'll see this evening. Thankfully, other aspects of his identity are more ambitious and fluid. Research interests lie broadly across the fields of software studies, contemporary art practice, cultural theory, and image politics, reflected in his academic position as associate professor and co-director of the Center for the Study of the Networked Image at London South Bank University, UK, and adjunct associate professor, Aarhus University in Denmark. Winnie Soon was born and raised in Hong Kong, increasingly aware of and confronting identity politics regarding its colonial legacy and post-colonial authoritarianism. As an artist, coder, researcher, they is interested in queering the intersections of technical and artistic practices as a feminist praxis, with works appearing in museums, galleries, festivals, distributed networks, papers, and books. Researching in the areas of software studies and computational practices, they is currently associate professor at Aarhus University in Denmark. It is our great pleasure to have you both here today launching this particular book. And now let me turn everything over to you both.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mark, for organizing this and also your introduction and everything. And also for everyone joining this book launch event. And I think it's also a couple of years ago we met and also have a relationship with the Humanities and Critical Studies Lab. Thanks for hosting and organizing this. And I think both Jeff and I think the activities in CCS is highly relevant in what we are doing and presenting today. So I just start with sharing the screen. with some sort of slides. Right. So you can, I think you can see it, right? Yeah, great. So we will briefly introduce the book. We will not take really long because we want to save time for more conversation with you all. So the book, Mark has mentioned, Aesthetic Programming, a Handbook of Software Studies. So from the book title, you may get a sense that it is something about programming in which has a relevance in the field of software studies. But then software studies is also an interdisciplinary field that draws upon cultural studies, computer science, critical theory, etc. Right? So although the book has already launched by the end of last year, but we recently launched a web version, also open access and open source. So we also want to use this context to introduce that at the end of our presentation. And Hayes, who is from Open Source Publishing, will be joining us as well towards the end. But we will keep it relatively short. So I just start off with the background, just to give you a little bit background regarding why Jeff and I have an idea to collaborate with each other in writing this book. And indeed, it is very much a situated context in Denmark, where in the time of 2015, we both worked at Aarhus University, and we were teaching two individual but very connected courses called Software Studies, the screen on the left, and also Aesthetic Programming. So to sort of like both courses to understand our computational and digital culture. So they are both, I think this is important as a context. The both courses offer in bachelor, first year in the program called Digital Design, which is operated within humanities, because it gives you a sense of a lot of scholars and educators here in this room as well. So you sort of get a sense of how students might look like if 95% of my students, basically, they literally don't have any programming experience and have difficulty in managing folder and path. So we want to see how these two courses complement each other and also make sense to first year students, which they find like thinking or thinking about programming is very difficult. And for them, it seems to be very difficult. And also they mentioned it seems very mathematical, right? So I have been teaching the course Aesthetic Programming for 7 years, and many ideas, approaches, or test and learn have been synthesized in the book. And Jeff and I share interests in cultural studies, critical theory, poetics, or politics of language, as Mark also mentioned about the book Speaking Code, computer science, as well as more important is creative and artistic practice. So we would like to see how these could be integrated into a book that is more like Introduction to Programming. But more importantly is we want to explore the more complex and deeply entangled set of relations between writing about software, coding about code, right? And also thinking about software culture, right? So we want to open up teaching or learning programming otherwise. So hand over to you, Jeff.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks for the invitation, Mark. So this is the way we describe it in the book. You know, the book explores the technical as well as cultural imaginaries of programming from its insides. It follows the principle that the growing importance of software requires a new kind of cultural thinking and curriculum that can account for and with which to better understand the politics and aesthetics of algorithmic procedures, data processing, and abstraction. So alongside learning to program, we take a particular interest in power relations that are still relatively under-acknowledged, such as inequalities and injustices related to class, gender, sexuality, as well as race and colonialism. This is not only related to our own subject positions, as our biographies, I think, demonstrated to some extent, and a politics of representation, but also to how power differentials are
Have we lost Jeff for a second? We may have lost me for a second.
You're just saying some of these inequalities relate to bandwidth and connectivity, obviously.
Well played.
But
We are back.
yeah. Okay. And
is it my bandwidth or is it overall bandwidth?
I think it might be me. I think my son is playing games in the room next door to me, which anyway. I was going on to say that we take inspiration largely from Matthew Fuller's excellent software studies collection from 2008, structured literally as a lexicon of key terms, key technical terms, but also that in itself takes its cue from Raymond Williams's book, Key Words, of course. So I suppose both those things come together very much in our thinking. And then we, again, I think refer to a lot of Matthew Fuller's thinking in adopting an approach of zooming in to the formal logic of computation and zooming out to the cultural implications of those processes of software. Taking our cue from this, we believe very much in paying attention to fundamental or key concepts from programming and the way that can provide us with an opportunity to open up new insights into aesthetics and critical theory. So not the other way around. I mean, that's again, really crucial, I think. We think it's important to work in this way, from the inner workings of software and its materiality, its material conditions. Further echoing cultural studies and cultural materialism of Williams and other people, and its foundations in an expanded notion of literacy. We're really interested in this interface with ordinary culture. Annette V's book, Coding Literacy from 2017, is one attempt, again, that we draw upon, which attempts to shift this focus from technical skill to wider social relations, to politics, if you like. V's argument for literacy not only benefits individuals who acquire certain skills, but also has potential wider cultural and social ramifications, helping to force coding out of its specialization in certain disciplines, in computer science, of course, and open up critical and aesthetic potential. I mean, in the book, we refer to cultural studies more explicitly, to Richard Hogarth's uses of literacy from the late 50s, which of course informed the whole cultural studies movement, at least in the UK, the Birmingham School. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there, Winnie, and move on to your next slide.
Yep. So on top of the recent book on coding literacy that Jeff has mentioned, there are also many scholars who work along this line. And other terms such as procedural literacy, which is introduced by Michael Matis, who work in the area of computational media and computer science. I think many of you might know him already here. So he recognized that computers play a critical role in contemporary culture, or consider this medium has its own unique conceptual possibilities. Right? So his earlier article was published in 2005 and addressing the problem of programming as seen as purely a technical skill. Maybe it also resonates with Sarah, you just mentioned about that, and overlook the theoretical and aesthetic concerns of new media. So one of the outtakes of this article is that he suggests, quote, being procedurally literate, which includes being able to unpack social and cultural assumptions of code and to understand the relation between creative expression and code, as well as being able to program with the aim for students to be able to participate in a variety of discourse, end quote. And I think this is important in a way like for newer generation to learn to code, not just only as a skill, but how to participate in humanistic discussion as well, right? So he said that current programming classes, especially on teaching and learning, are disconnected from social and cultural issues. Right. So if we trace a little bit more, Simon Pepper, who is a mathematician, computer scientist, and educator, who invented the programming language Logo, and has published his phenomenal book, Mindstorm, which is to teach children programming and mathematics. But the point that he has is also bringing back the more humanistic aspects of computational culture, and to consider how teaching programming as a form of computer literacy, which is needed to introduce in primary and even high school. So he wants to move beyond computer literacy as something used to be just for science and engineering. And he said, quote, "It is about whether personal computers and the cultures in which they are used will continue to be the creatures of engineers alone, or whether we can construct intellectual environments in which people who today think of themselves as humanists will feel part of, not alienated from, the process of constructing computational culture." End quote. So in that sense, so all these point to what does it mean then by teaching or even learning programming now, today, in humanities and in higher education. Right, there are some of the questions that I have in mind during the years of teaching the same course as static programming. But I also recognize that a lot of our students do not or haven't thought of to be a programmer in the future. So then what does it mean by teaching programming when they do not expect to be a programmer in the future? Also, one of the problems is that programming is still very much tied to employability. So what can they do with programming? So if you are interested, you can also take a look at Nick Montfort, the book Exploratory Programming, where he has an appendix to tackle the general question of why program. And secondly, then how to make sense of teaching programming for arts and humanities, in which students have different background and motivation, and how to sustain the motivation throughout, right? So if you have learned the conventional style of learning programming in a classroom taught by teacher with computer science background, which I did, and this becomes, I think, more urgent, I think, in terms of making it relevant to them and to our culture. And in a way, you don't want to lose any one of them along throughout the whole course, right? Then it comes to the third questions. What does it mean by teaching programming by humanists? So what are the concerns of humanities? Or what can humanities can offer in this context? And this point to the final question, how may we open up the teaching of programming otherwise, beyond the STEM approach and as a specialized discipline, if we talk about the notion of literacy that Jeff has mentioned just now? Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we're preaching to the converted here a bit, aren't we? But you know, but just to emphasize, you know, we're not so much interested in teaching programming in terms of problem solving or developing analytical skills, computational literacy, or computational thinking, if you like, but more thinking of how this is a way to engage with programming to question existing technological paradigms, and you know, with the idea that these things can be changed somewhat, at least on a symbolic, on a small scale. So aesthetic programming in this sense, you know, for us, for the book, is considered as a practice to build things, to make worlds, but also to produce immanent critique, drawing upon computer science, art, cultural theory. From another direction, of course, this comes close to Philip Agre's notion of critical technical practice, with its bringing together of formal technical logic and discursive cultural meaning. By engaging with aesthetic programming in these ways, we aim to further queer these intersections of critical and technical practices, as in the many examples we refer to in the book, mostly Winnie's work, as you may have noticed if you've looked. We consider programming to be a dynamic cultural practice, a way of thinking and doing in the world, and a means of understanding some of the complex procedures that underwrite and constitute our lived realities in order to act upon those realities.
So here come with a little more details about the approach that we use in teaching, but also use in our book. So Pepper introduced this really great concept of low floors, high ceilings. And I use it especially in students' weekly home assignment. And we interpret as something students can work with code in a minimal level, not necessarily need to be technically complex, but without a ceiling as well, so that they can explore the wild, both technically and conceptually. Maybe this is also influenced by our background and interest in creative and artistic practice. And this is especially useful, I think, because nowadays with so many instructional videos available online, and every programming language with a massive list of functions and syntax that you can use, right? Where every students have their own interest and motivation. And I find this become the key strategy to allow them to explore and do independent learning so that they can apply it in their weekly assignment, for example. And of course, you need to also set some form of constraints every week, but do not limit them to explore the potential of code or have a solid or concrete exact same outcome, right? And this is where they find motivated and interested in the subject matter. So in the book, we also demonstrate we have a weekly mini exercise, which is to encourage independent learning, because ultimately they need to learn how to, right, by themselves. But as a teacher, you kind of provide a structure to facilitate their exploration. So in a way, then the exercise address the weekly theme openly instead of looking for prescribed outcomes, and not everyone produce the same sketch as the absolute answer. And we do, the third one is it's maybe a bit controversial, right? But we do not take effective and efficient code to be a priority. So allowing them to have room to explore different ways of writing code and to express with code. So for example, like code poetry, code works, and we also have a chapter called Vocable Code to explore code, language, speech, and voices. Right? And we embrace querying this intersection of critical and technical practice, something simultaneously critical and technical, thinking while doing, and also trying to demystify theory and practice that is usually very demarcated in many of the education programs. And we also emphasize the usefulness of artistic practice for opening up more messy, expressive, speculative, and alternative imaginaries. And lastly, we embrace a plurality of ways of working with programming to explore the set of relations between writing, coding, and thinking to imagine, create, and propose alternatives.
Yeah, each chapter of the book starts with a flow chart to provide a diagram of the entangled relationships between the formal, technical, aesthetic, and conceptual aspects of the contents of that chapter. Behind Winnie and I, you can see another diagram, and this is the synopsis of the book, diagrammed out using GraphViz. So each chapter in this way, or each diagram, each diagram for each chapter captures the dynamic learning process in both concrete and abstract representation. The flowchart serves as a starting point to exemplify our approach of turning concepts inside out and the need to understand computational and programmable objects, relations, and processes in both logical and discursive form.
So we have chosen to work with P5.js, which is maybe a lot of you here already know is a JavaScript free and open source framework, visually driven with immediate feedback so that you can easily see on a web browser. But beyond it is open source, open access, and ease of use, there are other values that are at stake. If we do not take the best or most efficient or most powerful programming language in a technical sense as our first priority, so what if we emphasize humanistic values to work with technology? And we feel the tools and the community around that are important as well.
Yeah, and then if we were to zoom in on one chapter in particular, we might look at chapter 10, where many of the critical technical issues discussed through the other chapters come together in an examination of machine learning, or machine unlearning, as we put it. The example of Eliza and Eliza, both the program and the person in Pygmalion, taken together, emphasize how, when it comes to machine learning, both humans and machines train and are trained by these processes. In the case of the book, we speculate on whether we have been writing or teaching, writing a teaching or a learning book, if we assume that you have to learn something before you can actually teach it, and that the act of teaching can help you learn something. To what extent are we attempting to train, and who is training who? What might machine learning and radical pedagogy learn from each other, moving beyond the oppressive subject-object relations that people like Paulo Freire pointed to? you know, to a point where learners can become more active participants in their own learning. So we sort of conclude with, we need to learn and unlearn how to learn. Then in a bonus chapter, we playfully call a bonus chapter really, or afterword, we experiment with ML5.js machine learning library. Using a recurrent neural network, it learns from the previous chapters of the book and generates a new text based on the generalized style of the others. I'll read an extract. In a feminist for this chapter, Live and Unpi and the source code to move need to develop produces itself. Chapter 8, query data, trans face, has a class, a smart, that is returns a closer loops are developed, a modifying code with the code, or solve an auga, was partly rendering to the technical intelligence as a form of software. A new emoji stares are requires itself. It's very tempting to continue, I will. Universals, us too, and happens entries that we do not just automaticulus on focusing of this sense of hiding up the present in generator form from software and originally deeply encourage the execution and commercializing of learning to develop, because the function draw, the program and ellipses is a new syntax with other syntaxes from the curated by specifying compring try was the webcam tracker practices and conceptual thinking to use. I won't read the whole chapter.
So towards the end, we also want to talk about open access and open source publishing, and also point to our next project, which is more inspired by the process of writing this book over the years. So we have written this book entirely on Git as a repository, a software versioning system that is commonly used in software development among developers. So it's keep track of all the versioning or writing since day one. We start the book, and how we overriding each other writing, and all the scripts that we use, like generating the PDF or generating the flowchart in each of the chapter. So we follow the principles of free and open source culture in which things can be added, studied, and modified. And we encourage others to fork the copy, make changes that is more relevant to your context. Add a chapter or a new theme, change some examples that are relevant or reference that work better for others. So we want to open up other ways of learning programming and make space for others. So in other words, we see this book is also like an experimental and computational publishing as an endless loop and distribution. And with this workflow of Git to print or Git to PDF or website, just now we walked through the machine learning chapter. So how does this way of publishing open up other forms of knowledge production? So I guess we have Hayes on the line. Are you here, Hayes? Our designer from open source publishing?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. So
Steph is also here, Stephanie.
Oh, Stephanie is also here.
Fantastic.
Oh, that's great.
Yes.
That's fantastic. So just wondering, because Hayes and Stephanie are our designer of the book, and also made it open access, and also the font style, and also the super nice cover you can see in our background, also made by them as well. So wondering if you want to say a few words, maybe in relation to your process and the way of how you work with publishing. Yeah.
Yes, I can. Stephanie, do you want to say something, or shall I start maybe?
To prepare the launch, I was a bit surprised by the book launch yesterday. So I let you if I have some questions, I will come.
Yeah, feel free to. Yes. So maybe it's good to explain. Stephanie and me are both part of a group of graphic designers based in Brussels called Open Source Publishing. And in our work, we only use open source software. And at first, I think our practice was an experiment to see whether it was possible to make graphic design using only open source software. But this proved possible quite quickly. So over time, I think it has become more, or actually the sort of dogmatic choice using only open source software, or an opportunity to think how you can make graphic design in a different way. And I think this book is a very good example of how you can make graphic design in a different way. In that the design was sort of developed parallelly to the writing process, and used the same source. So Winnie and Jeff are writing in the Git repository, and we are pulling their writings in Markdown and then converting them to HTML to generate the website. But we're also using HTML to actually generate the book. In this case, we use a JavaScript library called Page.js that tries to sort of fix the finicky details that you get or that you run in when you try to make something for page media using a web browser. The web browser is designed to make objects or let's say pages with infinite lengths, where a book, of course, has a fixed page. Sometimes there's need to be moved, or images need to be reduced, page numbers need to be inserted. So that's why we use a specific JavaScript library. But to us, it's also then interesting to think or to experience how this makes you design in a different way, where you are not working like a sculpture in InDesign, designing spread by spread, but you're really designing the process and you're designing the rules. You're sort of making a machine and then you sort of test it, and then of course it breaks often, but then you sort of come back to the code and you unify it again.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah.
I guess that's our presentation. And Jeff, do you have anything you want to add on?
No, just to say that this is a really crucial part of the project. You know, this approach to the design, to the making of the object. You know, both the web object and the print object, and that it's people. There's an invitation for people to make their own versions. You know, this is really crucial, and something that this community in particular might be interested in taking on.
So maybe to add on to that, Jeff, is to highlight is that all the tools that we used to make the design are normally encoded or are within the repository. And we also started on a README that would allow you to generate on PDF or at least website.
Yeah, and on a simple level, all the text is there to be rewritten.
So just showing the repository here. So I just stopped my share screen. That's our presentation, and look forward to your questions and conversation.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for that presentation. That was really wonderful. I was having a side conversation with Talia about how really just, every fiber of my being is excited about the existence of this book and its process. So really congratulations on all of this. Hey, I want to clear up a couple of things from the book before we launch into question and answer, although again, feel free to take this wherever you will. So rolling back a little bit, title of the book, Aesthetic Programming. Our audience could misunderstand that title, although I don't think after hearing your talk, they really could. But do you just want to talk briefly about why you chose the word aesthetic to lead into your programming title? Yeah,
we could. I mean, again, this is part of its situatedness, I would say, that in the Danish context, in a humanities department, there's a particular understanding of aesthetics that comes very much from tradition of the Frankfurt School. So when we say aesthetics, we mean political aesthetics, and that very much drives a lot of the teaching in in Aarhus in Denmark, I would say, in humanities departments to this day, even these old references back to white German media theorists, and we tried to make that point in the introduction, in the preface, that maybe this isn't good enough, but still we think there's a use for immanent critique and some of these kind of conceptual tools that underpin aesthetic theory.
But it's also tied with, of course, also aesthetics practice as well, like artistic practice, and also different artists work with code critically as well to produce artifacts or to work with code to think about how to make works, right? So I guess it's both the line of thinking about critical theory, but also as an aesthetic practice as well.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about this for hours probably. There's, there's there was a text I co-wrote with Alex McLean and Adrian Ward from the early 2000s, the aesthetics of generative code, and this tried to make the argument for looking at source code as an aesthetic object as well. So and again, not just pretty, not beautiful, but critical aesthetics. Although that didn't come across very strongly at the time, it got some criticism on that basis.
Yeah, well, and again, your book someone only has to read the first few pages of your book to have that cleared up. But I thought for people watching the recording it might be useful. Also, I just want to show people what a chapter looks like in case they haven't gone to the website and downloaded it themselves just yet. So I'm just going to pull up the PDF real quick, which isn't the most beautiful way to look at this, but just to show you the basic layout of any one of the main content chapters. We start out with a diagram. It goes into really beautiful setup section, which is going to contextualize whatever exercise we're going to look at. I mean, again, this is where it stops being anything like a traditional how to program book, right? Because even with their Hello World example, it is not about okay, now we're going to it's not utilitarian. Let's figure out how this machine works. We get the context of Hello World programs. And then we're going to get, after the setup, we're going to get the start section, followed by working environment, a few more details, technical details. And again, part of this is specific to this particular example. And then it starts to walk us through both the activity and sort of explaining the code we're about to use. Then has a really, this is where it's going to be very easy to adopt for any programming class in the humanities in particular. We get the in-class activity, information about how the code gets processed. And again, I apologize, folks. I'm being a little clumsy and hasty with this, but I am quickly going to bring you to my favorite section, which is the while section. The while section, after each one of these code examples in the book, operates as a critical and cultural reflection that not only comments on the code we've just seen, but complicates it, complements it, enriches it by tying it into a larger theoretical discussion within a broader context, both in the digital humanities and in computer science, and then beyond. And then we get continuation assignments for the students about where they could take things next with the run me, read me parts of the book, followed by some required reading and some further reading. And all of this context, again, serves to transport this series of exercises into something that is constantly commentating on itself. So just to pull out a couple of my favorites, when dealing with loop structures, for example, let me pull that one up in my own text. The while section begins. It's in this closing section to the chapter, it seems appropriate to emphasize that while loops and for loops allow code to be executed repeatedly based on a given condition. The loop can be thought of as a repeating if statement and offers a good way of challenging conventional structures of linear time and demonstrating how computers utilize time differently. And then it goes on from there. So So at no point, while there are some really crucial practical parts of this book that help the person who's going to be teaching it support students, I think, and the students who are learning it to be able to use it. But then these wow sections, again, to me, just transport the book. Another one I'm going to read just briefly from another chapter, the data chapter section. Under late capitalism, I do believe this is the first programming book that teaches beginners how to program that has a section that begins under late capitalism. Temporality itself seems to have been captured, and there is a relentless incursion of the non-time of 24/7 into every aspect of social or personal life. There are, for example, almost no circumstances now that cannot be recorded or archived as digital imagery or information. That's a quote from John Crary, and then they continue with their reflection. And so again, just to give people a broader sense of some of the dynamism of this book, which again, for someone who's for a long time been making similar arguments to the one that Jeff and Winnie are making about the nature of code, I think continue to open up for those who again, and maybe this might be I'll turn this into a question so we can go back into discussion mode. But it has been my experience that those who traditionally have to teach programming in a CS context are so focused on helping students build things that function that these ancillary, they would perceive as ancillary discussions of culture would just get in the way. And so, and it would seem an annoyance if they were forced to include them in their own courses. What kind of reception have you received from those who teach traditional programming classes to either your position on code or on teaching code, or perhaps even on the book itself?
I can also respond with something which we put it as an appendix slide, which may be worth to show. So I guess it's also tell a little bit about how coding has been culturally perceived, right? So like, for example, 2017, we received the feedback from the students, like code is not a gentleman's club that only belongs to computer scientists. And then aesthetic programming was not just programming 1.1, but instead a much more reflective and critical course. It was great to see behind the code and try to decode the greater picture in a digital culture context. So the themes have been really interesting, and it's exposed many minorities yet to be talked even more about in the digital culture today. So I guess it's also in responding to your question, Mark, is I guess it's what we are doing for this book is we are not saying like, oh, this is to be the approach, but I think I just have a feeling that there's so much opportunity and potential about learning to code or teaching code. And we really want to open up the space to allow different ways of doing. Yeah.
Very good.
The greatest response in a way would be for someone to fork it and do their own version. You know, that's I'm emphasizing the same point.
Yeah.
I love it. I love the nature of that invitation. Again, something also uncommon even in the humanities, I suspect, or as I've experienced. Let's get. I'm going to bring in some questions from other folks. Sarah, did you want to state and follow up on your question a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I asked it right before we dove into that section, but I am curious if you wanted to touch a little bit more on the process of writing in GitHub, both doing that collaboratively on the platform and sort of publicly in a way how that experience was, and if you had contributors outside of the two of you, or even just Winnie, you mentioned like writing over each other, rewriting each other. So sort of that process and how it fit into what the open source publishing folks were talking about. That's, I don't know, just sort of if you wanted to elaborate on that process. I also see that connecting to what you were saying before about radical pedagogy in a way too, that this sort of combination of writing and thinking and coding all going together, that you're sort of taking the writing process toward coding as much as you're doing the opposite.
Yeah, we're in danger of like endlessly falling into a kind of loop of our own self-reflexivity, I think, with all these processes.
No, in the best way, not a critique at all. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, but I think it's worth from the teaching. We started this process with a workshop that Gijs and Stephanie ran for us in Denmark. And then actually we went away for a couple of days together, the four of us. And actually they taught us some of these, some of the kind of protocols around the way that they work, you know, with these scripts, with these publishing scripts. And that was before we then started the writing more formally. So we started again from a set of technical premises, I would say, which I think is really important. Then, of course, writing it, we had just had a lot of fun, you know, because of the nature of the book. I mean, you can tell from some of the comments, and we both became really obsessed with endless commits. Yeah.
But I guess it's also just an add-on is I think this approach is really allow us to rethink about the process of book making and book production, because as a lot of you have book publishing experience before as well, is usually the authors have to submit their final manuscript quite early on, and then sort of like you have to freeze the production of the words, right? And then you pass on to editors or other reviewers to make endorsement, and then the final step would be the designer step in, right? And then to make the design, right? So, but the interesting thing for this process is that four of us, like Stephanie, Hayes, me, and Jeff, we are at the same time working, and they continuously planning their design, but then we continuously making our content. But even for yesterday, we are still updating the Git repository. So with this script that Hayes and Stephanie have been doing, so it allows us to constantly updating and just generating with the script when there's a version that we want to upload again, for example, right? But within Jeff and I, the also interesting thing about Git is that there's a versioning system as well. So in a way, I also, so it's similar, not really similar, but I mean like Google Doc, for example, right? You also know what the other person have been written. But I also like the feeling, this is more feelings, like okay, so Jeff has written something in the last few days, so I have to catch up a little bit more, you know. So we try to start writing in different chapters. Like for example, like I start with the first two and then jump a little bit, and then he will look at it and then also add and continue to edit, and then I also override his, and then sometimes we have to have discussion about like, do you think this example is actually working? So we have a lot of dialogues, but also like test and learn as well, like because it's also teaching the course as well, we change the dynamic of the references. For example, oh, it doesn't work for these references, it has to be the others. So if you look at the Git repository, I think there are many commits and the history that can look in. But I think it's also an interesting separate project to look into how writing is done collaboratively in this manner, you know. So, but it's a separate thing.
Absolutely, and I love thinking about someone who embarks upon the project of writing the scholarship and criticism of the way this book was written, and tracing down all those changes and exploring those as well. I find it fascinating because you know, I hurried up and bought Code as Creative Medium, which another book that I highly recommend. And then as soon as I got it, I flipped through, and I sunk into a deep depression because they don't include any of their code in the book itself, and then I asked them about this and they said, of course, because we were worried about it becoming outdated so quickly. And then I think about Nick, who just had to publish a new version of exploratory programming because I believe it was primarily because of the switch from Python 2 to Python 3.
And also processing, he also included processing in the second version as well, I think.
So again, you know, part of the beauty of you know, writing the static book that doesn't try to teach anybody any kind of programming is, sorry, that's self-plug, is that you get to stop working on it at some point. So you guys might be doing this book for life, just so you know. We have a question.
Hence the invitation.
we have a question that I'm going to read to you guys from Gottfried that came in the chat. He's got spotty internet. So he writes, from browsing the book, I get the impression that there isn't so much preciousness in the code that is part of the book. You might have already touched upon this a bit, but I'd be curious if you could talk about how much the code wants to be read as text, etc.
I actually think all the code, actually, all the sample code in the chapters, they are really specially made for learning and also for reading as well. But if I have to highlight as text, as language, if you go into the direction of ELIT, so I think the chapter 7 vocable code is even more apparent, like is really something that people can see it as code poetry that can read aloud. But also at the same time is the interesting thing about code poetry, isn't it? Is this tension, right, between like computer language and the natural language, and how it becomes entangled and as a constraint, but also poetics in this way, right? So, but also like the GitLab version, the repository with more comments lines as well. So it's also like offering like a different kinds of reading, because like as a book, so as a physical book, we are also unsure, you know, we try to make it minimal. Like I think it's every chapter, the code is within 100 lines of code for easier comprehension. And also some of the chapter might be split into a few libraries or a few JS files. But I think we also try to make it readable and accessible and easier to comprehend, you know, not feeling like, oh shit, there's like 1,000 lines of code that I have to comprehend. You know, I like the fact that it starts with something small, and then we can start to grow and getting slightly more complex. So in that sense, like code, in a way, I see it as also like a text, really, not just only about the comment, but also paying attention to what are the namings, what are the structures that we can explain along the way as well. Yeah.
Excellent. All right, I have some thoughts on that, but I'm going to save them because we have a few more questions. Talia asked the question. Well, Talia, do you want to ask your question live?
Yeah, sure. Does my microphone work?
Yep, working perfectly.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So I was talking to Mark yesterday about my frustrations about the traditional computer science course track, and it's complete like abstraction of context around like the function of what is being built, or like the harm that programs can cause. So my question was, do either of you have any input on how I could bring the cultural and contextual awareness you try to impart upon your humanities students to my peers in a traditional undergrad computer science program?
I think one of the ways, what we have been dealing with this is we have two courses running in parallel, the software studies and aesthetic programming. Both sort of like have a slightly different focus. One is more theoretical, and then the other one is more practical or practice-based, but they are both aligned in terms of the value in terms of the field of software studies, to seeing like software as a cultural object. I think that is really important if you position it as not just a technical object, but as a cultural object, to see through the related entanglements and also relations with our society and culture. But I think in general, I feel this is still a long way to go, really. You know, I also have presented this thinking to more computer science people, and it's also received different forms of criticism as well, because I guess it's like different tradition has a different priority, right? Which it doesn't mean that it is not important. Like code has to be efficient, has to be learned, the complex, really deep logic. But I guess it's how, I think we also discussed it in our last chapter, is how do we respect or learn from each tradition in order to really move towards to a more querying of this demarcation. And Jeff, do you have anything you want to add on?
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious that we're, you know, this comes from a humanities program and not a computer science program, but obviously it would be great to think that it could be applied. I would suggest, you know, working, you know, as we've tried to with the curriculum for this, working from people's direct experience, you know, working from the kind of identity positions that they take up is a really good place to start. You know, these things have become so mainstream in a way, you know, to take a feminist position, to think about the decolonial. You know, surely computer science students respond to this as well. Do they not? Yeah, but I think that's the place to start, you know, from people's experience. This is the cultural studies approach as well, I would say, not to start from high theory or abstract ideas, but to talk, you know, to talk from experience.
Tough to do when you're the student in the course making those changes. But
they still have lives.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. But again, you're fighting against the whatever programming industrial machine that is cranking out programmers who hopefully don't question what they're working on too much and just get the job done efficiently and work 60 hours a week and et cetera, or work 24/7, as you put it, right? So it's anyway, that's why this book is a necessary intervention.
What's your answer, Talia? What have you been trying?
Well, I think I've been trying my best to draw on my own lived experience and try to connect with people. But I also sometimes run into a problem where due to my intersection of identities, I end up performing much more emotional labor than I really should be as an individual student in a program that is aimed at promoting a very traditional computer science like approach, where jam-packed with a lot of mathematical and practical programming, and maybe one ethics course, one writing course. It's been a sometimes exhausting balancing act. I tried to find people in like amongst my peers to help me, and I tried to find professors who like see things the way I do, although a lot of times they're outside the computer science department, and look for their advice. And but I just keep trying to talk to more people and see if I can help them identify things in their own background, so that it's not just me pushing people forward.
Thanks.
Thank you, Talia. Yeah. So again, it's good to get the broader context in which a book like this intervenes. We have a question that's going to change our subject a little bit from Avisti. Do you want to ask that question, or would you like me to read it?
Anders?
Okay, maybe I'll read this one.
Oh.
Did you have any well, first, I'm going to read the whole thing because it's got a compliment. I hate to leave those off. Hey, Winnie and Jeff, thanks for this amazing work. A question about code framework. Did you have any considerations, alternatives to picking P5.js? I love P5 for its careful considerations in regards to diversity and accessibility. But for new programmers, JavaScript is very messy and hard to learn. JavaScript code is asynchronous and hard to handle. Browser vendors are known for not complying with standards. Types are not strict. There's no clear programming paradigm, and so on. In short, were there really any alternatives to P5.js? And how did you decide? Love, Anders.
Well, thanks for your question, Anders. I guess it's for our, I mean, especially for this book, is really for those, because I think it's a very particular context in Denmark. So from time to time, I really experience like more than 95% of the students, they do not have coding experience, including HTML, CSS, and path and foldering, right? So, and P5 or processing is very much designed from visual artists and for visual artists and designers as well. So in a way, I feel, or open frameworks too. So in a way, these kind of open source programs and software is sort of have this kind of immediate feedback that is easier for beginners to comprehend. I sort of like, I learned Java when I was young, when I was in my high school, and Force Pro or Visual Studio or Visual Basic, you know, and all this I find actually quite complicated actually to setting things up, and also it's not very visually intuitive in a way. But I also think one of the key important factors to consider, because you also mentioned about how did you decide, right? I think the community also matters as well, because I don't want to teach the students the hard skills, right? Okay, this is how C++ work. Or this is the syntax of C++. You know, I want them to understand the principles of programming so that they learn the skill on how they find their own resources. Like, you know, like Daniel Schiffman has a really good resource on the Coding Train series. And also the community, like processing and P5 is really helpful to each other. So I feel as a beginner or as a new coders, how to make them don't feel intimidating, I feel is really important, like to have a welcoming community that they can look for resources and to talk to and to find like-minded people, more than they are able to code something that is more in good performance, you know, technically in a way. So there is a trade-off in a way, but also at the same time, I feel once they have the basic principles of programming, so if they want to move forward to something else, right, to C or C++, there's already like sort of a process that they go through, how like variables or loops or things work, and then they can easily to get on with other programming language. So that's more the idea behind.
Yeah, it's important that, isn't it? There's just something to build on, but also the ethics is really crucial. You know, as Anders points out in his posts there, you know, the ethics are crucial, I think.
And I guess it's also why we choose P5 as well is because I think it is important for any one of us start to work with code to also be careful about what kind of tools that you use, to think about why these kind of tools exist and what are the values behind these tools and what kind of values that we are subscribing to as well. So I think these are also like add on to Jeff is crucial. They are crucial questions.
We probably have time for about one more question. I want to read another passage from the book briefly that I really found to be powerful. This comes from, let's see, the chapter on data capture. This line of argument makes reference to the philosophy of Gilbert Simondon, to the transformational process by which individuation, how a person or thing is identified as distinguished from other persons or things, is caught up with other individuations. There is no space or need, we think, to go into this in detail in this publication, but for now it suffices to say that trans individuation describes the shift between the individual I and the collective we, and how they are transformed through one another. We hope something of this happens to this book project, which is already collective by design, but also opens up further possibilities for the production of new versions and social relations in its reworking. Of course, this involves tinkering with the underlying codes and values associated with data capture and our ability to reinvent the latter's main purpose. This is an open invitation to not only capture data, but to also unleash its other potentials. I just find that to be the ethos of your project, the ethos of the examples, your attention to, or attentiveness to both the subject positions that the student brings, that you bring, and the cultural context of programming itself, I think, again, perform that intervention you're making at every turn in this book. And that, again, to me, that's what makes it such an exciting work. I have to ask a question because I'm a fanboy. Can you talk about how the Vocable Code collaboration originally began?
I think, again, Winnie, you need to speak to this.
Okay, I guess it's like the case is I'm also a fan of Jeff's book, the Speaking Code one. So I remember he has a chapter with Alex, right? The chapter called Vocable Code. And that's really inspired me to think about deeper into not just only about code and language, but code and speech, and how code has a way to politically express stuff as well. It's not like a neutral command, right, in a way. So that's really the departing point, inspire me to make the artwork, Vocable Code, right? So Vocable Code is like play with the chapter from Jeff, but also like in itself is a code poetry that is an installation and also is a program. But then I also invite a lot of other friends and other people who helped me to complete a sentence that with queer is just a sentence. And then I made a program sort of produce like an audio literature, right? And Jeff is one of the participants. Like I think his line is queer. I think that is your line, I guess.
Yeah, that was at the time of Brexit. So I was inspired by Brexit is Brexit, and that means Brexit. And that's just inside.
yeah. But then for this work is I'm deliberately really want to think about like the problem that I have with coding. So the problem that I have with coding is I find in my everyday life, because I've been coding for more than 20 years, I guess. So I have a problem in a real life is like I started to use the coding concept in my daily life. So the conditional statement, if I'm hungry, then I eat something. If I'm thirsty, then I drink, So starting to feel myself without this kind of in-betweenness, So then I find it's why it's like this, So I started to feel like this kind of computational thinking on the one hand is really important and powerful and empowering, but they are also written in a way or structured in a way with certain kinds of ideologies as well, right? And also the way how code is being structured and being used in a lot of different big corporations, for example, right? So then that's why I have written the source code in a way is to think through how we might think about writing code otherwise, beyond efficiency or best performance, but to also incorporate really ridiculous syntax that is not really useful at all. But I find sounding wise is really poetic in the Vocable Code. So that's informed the chapter. And then afterwards, I made a work, and then we start our book collaboration, Jeff, right? We have a performance, And then we start to write a separate book that's sort of like, how can we also bring in some kinds of ideas and concepts around binary thinking, around logics, or around querying, the ways of querying code. And then we start to perform physically in front of audience. So have a very different versions. And then Anders also here as well. He also made a live coding version for us, which very useful for teaching. So I see Vocable Code as something like an artwork, but also as a very pedagogical teaching tools, but also as a way of thinking, how can we work with code differently? And I think e-literature or this kind of code poetry is very unusual in computer science curriculum, I have to say, right? And I think it has so much cultural influence or trajectory in the past as well. Even computer scientists also work with the language of code, right? So we think this is an important chapter that we have to check in the book and give voice to the language and to think about the language politics as well.
Excellent. Winnie, this isn't your only open access book that you're rolling out this year. There's also Fix My Code.
Yeah.
Do you want to say something about the relationship between that book and this book?
Oh, there's a relation because for Fix My Code, I work with Colinia Sofrank, who is a net artist. And it's primarily based on her artwork called Net Art Generator. And we have actually used Net Art Generator in our chapter. I think it's chapter 8 or 9 called Querying Data. So in a way to think about Google APIs and API politics. So there's a relation between the two. So that one is open access as well, but it's a different types of ebook. And this is another way of working with Git, with Jeff and open source publishing. So it's also give me a different ideas in relation to think about like the format of ebook and how this kind of Git publishing or software publishing might open up very different ways of inviting others to contribute and make space for others. Yeah.
Excellent. Jeff, a second ago when you were showing us the book, you showed us the website with the live code in it. Can you show us that one more time if your connection is stable enough?
Yeah, I think Winnie will need to show you.
Okay.
Which one?
Yeah, I don't know which one you're referring to either. What did we show?
It was the website version of the book with the live code on the side.
Oh yeah. Let's show that because
that's a great thing for people to get a sense of the power of this publication.
Yeah, I think
it's also a good way of drawing Case and Stephanie back in, maybe. Yeah.
And do you want to say a bit, Hayes and Stephanie, maybe? So just shortly is, so we have the web version is also, this is color, which is very different from the PDF version, which is black and white, and also the physical book. And we also think that it is useful because other people can really change the code here and also execute as well. And then they can easily like hide the sketch and then they can continue to read. And then at one point when it comes to source code and explaining the code and want to look at how the code work and related to the chapter, so they can open up the half screen. And if they want to also like tinkering with it, then it can also like bring it up as a full screen mode to both look at the source code as well as the generated version, the interface of it. So every chapter we have a sample code that it works in a similar way. Some of the chapters we have more than one. So some might have two source code to able to run and execute. So you can see this is also how, at this moment in time, how the auto chapter generator is generating some interesting text for us to read aloud at one point.
Yeah, can't wait. Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah. So we hope this is something that is also useful. And we also have the script on the Git repository. So in a way, if people would be interested to fork a copy and make changes and add your own chapter that is relevant to yours, you can also easily reproduce your web version for your own teaching and learning as well. Yeah.
Well, I've already been talking in back channel with Sarah about forking this and seeing what we could dream up. Although I do think it would be a delightful thing for us to incorporate into the next Critical Code Studies working group, just an invitation to the participants to do their forking in variations. We have a question from Gottfried. He asked in the chat, would you recommend reading the book via the website, the PDF? Jeff said move between modes, he'd say. I would throw out there, I was telling the authors earlier that I was reading theirs on an iPad, and the iPad version of the PDF just, you know, such a beautiful rendering of this visual design. But obviously we just saw the working version. And of course, we don't want to impoverish our wonderful artists here. We should buy the hard copy, have it on our shelves. It's a great archival version that will last maybe even longer than some of these other forms and have a kind of object permanence that the other ones don't.
Mm-hmm.
I hate to say it, but I think we've reached the end of our time together today. And I just want to start by thanking all of Stephanie, Hayes, Winnie, Jeff, thank you so much for making time to join us today. I'm so glad that you came. I'm glad you made the time. Your generosity of spirit, and of course, all of the things that you've put forward in this book are in such harmony with our larger projects here at the Hacks Lab and Critical Code Studies in general. Really, thank you so very much.
Thank you. And
thank you
thanks
all
to everyone, and Hayes and Stephanie for coming too.
And as we wrap up, there is a small chance we'll have another one of these events in June, depending on my own personal bandwidth and those of the members of the Hacks Lab. If any of the folks who are gathered here today would like to become affiliated with the Hacks Lab or in any way, just reach out. I should mention we do host these, amongst other things, these monthly ELIT reading group events, but also we're gearing up already for the 2022 Critical Code Studies Working Group, our biennial event that brings together scholars and artists of all sorts. As I mentioned at the top of our gathering, the ELO conference is happening starting on Monday, so there's still time to register for that. Also, just for our larger network, I want to throw out there that there's a call for the Society for Literature, Science, and the Arts. They have a June 1st deadline. This is for a conference that's happening in Michigan. It bounces back and forth between Europe and the United States. Really wonderful polymathic group. But given the pandemic situation, they are also open. It is also a virtual event this year. So June 1st is the deadline for that. Of course, on the mailing list, I'll let you know about future opportunities and things like that. Jeff, Winnie, any parting words before we send you off back to your Friday evening?
I can't think of anything. I'm ready for the gin and tonic. It's evening here.
But thank you all, and also thanks for Hayes and Stephanie stopping by.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for everyone's attention, and feel free to do what you want with the book.
Yeah, it is Creative Commons license, so you can do whatever.
Yeah.
Excellent. Invitation accepted. All right. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to stop the recording now, and I will see you all in the future.